So today we're gonna look at what's happening with our brain sometimes when it's not working so well, and how do we naturally help it grow or balance or function at its best. And so, peak brain. So that's what we would like to see, our brain functioning in its capacity. However, I think a lot of times the issues that we have, we don't necessarily think that it's something happening in our brain. So things like, oh, how come I am just feeling a little lacking in energy, or like I'm not able to focus? Do I need to eat something, or am I just getting older, or just we assume that our mental capacity will just degrade because we are aging, for example, right? So things like brain fog, or just memory slipping, or even issues related to sleep. We always hear, how come older people just don't sleep as well, right? And we assume that is normal. But I think oftentimes we don't realize that of course, there's something physical happening with our body as well as our brain. In fact, our brain plays a huge role in that. And so that's more of I guess, lighter symptoms that we oftentimes see, that we just kind of chalk it up to aging, or maybe I have too much work, or because I now have kids, it's a lot of stress in life, things like that. But of course, there are also challenges we know that's definitely brain related, things like depression or anxiety, bipolar, and things like that. We know it's definitely brain related, but at the same time, we also oftentimes do not realize that even though these are clearly brain related things, they have other physiological causes as well. So somehow we kind of either ignore it as a brain issue, or we remove the brain from everything else. And I think that's a unfortunate, I guess, dichotomy that we kind of set up between our mind and our body, and it seems to be pretty pervasive in terms of how we see the struggles that we have. I was just looking at student depression recently. In fact, I was just looking at some articles recently. It talked about, just because of the pandemic in the US, student suicide rates, teen suicide rates doubled in just this past year, 2020. And we hear about vaccines, people dying from COVID, but we don't hear about all the emotional struggles that people are having. And this is way before. This is only like up to 2017. You already see the trend is going up, and so it's even worse. Suicide rate, same thing. Most of the deaths are pretty stable, and some even are decreasing. But for some reason, suicide rate is going up. But that's not it. It's not just the depressions and emotional challenges, even things like autism in the US is going up. And I know for sure it's in Taiwan as well, because I used to work in disability services, and I'm always in contact with parents with adult children even with autism. And that's even more challenging, because now they're fully grown, and now they are strong, and they have the capacity to, when they don't feel well and they cannot help themselves but act out, it can get pretty violent. Not because they want to, but just because there are other stimulations that they cannot internally handle, their brain is not able to handle, right? But that rate is going up worldwide. ADHD as well, focus issues. This is obviously, because maybe part of it is due to diagnosis, or just the recognition, the openness to talk about it. But US, you see, has a very high rate of ADHD medication use, and it's been going up since they started tracking, and it's still increasing. But the thing is, in Asia, or it's not even just in Asia, but the fastest growing country with ADHD medication right now is Canada, Hong Kong, and Taiwan right now in the world. So Taiwan is also going up in terms of cases of individuals with ADHD, as well as the medication use. I personally have trained neurofeedback many kids now, just so with ADHD. Part of it is because they see the side effect of medication and they want to get out of it, or the parents just don't want to put their kids on medication. So they were looking for other ways. But yeah, the usage is definitely going up. And it is concerning because with medication, some of the ADHD medication is very similar in terms of its chemical structure to popular narcotics or drugs. Because one of the forms that's pretty popular is Adderall. It's very similar to methamphetamine. Yeah, so it is basically trying to excite or activate the part of your cortex that's not able to function. Right? So, but that's why in many countries, students will use it to keep themselves awake, to study longer when they have the cramp or something like that. It's like a smart drug. Yeah, but it's pretty powerful, mind-altering chemical. But sometimes you can't really blame them because they're not functioning. So they need something to reactivate their brain, so to speak. Right? But the thing is, that doesn't need to be the case, because our brain can function well if we give it good nutrient, good information, good recovery and healing. And our brain is supposed to function well. I mean, that's the way it is designed. But we have, I think, oftentimes forgotten what peak functioning brain looks like in some ways. So if you want to look at our brain as well as our whole nervous system in a simple schema, we can look at it this way. So a peak functioning brain is one where it's stable and flexible. Stable and flexible. So what do I mean by that? Okay, so it's stable means it's able to operate at that peak range for a considerable period of time. In fact, most of the time. Our physical function has this tendency for homeostasis. That means it likes to operate in a certain range. And that's because that's how our body is designed. Like blood sugar, it's not good when it's too high, it's not good when it's too low. It should be in an optimal range. Our heart rate is the same thing. Our body temperature, our hormonal levels, they all have a homeostatic range. How much mineral that our body has even. Yeah, so your body is always working to keep it in a certain range. And that includes our brain function as well. So we function the best when we are in this focused but relaxed state. Same thing for our nervous system. Both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous, or the autonomic nervous system, operates the best in a balanced state, right? So our whole brain, in fact, is part of that system. So our brain does its best when it's in that focused but relaxed state. So that's the stability. It should be able to keep itself in that range most of the time. But it also needs to be flexible because there are times of high stress or high demand. So for example, when it comes to focus, we actually do our best work when we are able to just focus on something but not too tense. Right? When you're too tense, you actually feel like you cannot think, right? Yes, because that's the optimal range. But it does need to ramp up sometimes. Let's say you are in a very high threat environment, then your brain goes into narrow focus, picking out the most important pieces of information. Like, let's say you are in a war, in battle, right? You are hyper-focused. And it needs to do that. That's part of our function. And it turns off everything else that's non-essential. It allows you to focus. So it needs to be able to get there, but it also needs to be able to come back to this focused, relaxed state. In fact, it also needs to be flexible enough so that it turns down and goes into sleep, right? So that's the flexibility we need to have. And it's not just with focus, that's with mood as well, right? Our emotional state, most of the time, should be pretty well balanced. But when there is danger, whether it's relational danger or physical danger or just kind of a high demand because of deadline or things like that. So sometimes you feel more ramped up, right? So, but that's important because that process also activates many of our physiological signals so that we can have the energy and the capacity to go and meet that demand, right? But usually we don't stay up there. We need to be able to come back here. And sometimes we need to be able to just relax and have fun and joke around, right? You need to be able to tone down. So that flexibility needs to be there. But a lot of times we get stuck here. We're always anxious or upset or just heightened emotion, right? Until we cannot take it and we just crash, right? So optimal operation is stability plus flexibility. And that's the same thing with our energy as well, mental energy as well. Most of the time our brain should be able to just hum along with good capacity, good energy. And you're not gonna feel like, oh, my brain is not working, it's tired, it's brain fog, whatever. Most of the time it shouldn't be like that. It should be able to go for a long time. And when you are supposed to go to sleep, you should be able to say, hey, now it's time to recover and I'm just gonna fall asleep, right? But I think nowadays what we're experiencing is we are either stuck always in the emergency mode, or we are stuck in a depressive mode or a low energy mode, and we're not functioning there. Or sometimes it's chaotic, like somebody with bipolar. Yes, because sometimes you can be so intense, you think you're Superman, you can do everything, and then next day you could crash. Right? Or if you know somebody with bipolar, there are periods, maybe even weeks or months, they are just out there doing everything. They think they're invincible. But that's not reality. They're actually hyper agitated, hyper aroused. But then after that, they fall into severe depression. I know because my mom was like that for many, many years. That's before I knew anything about this, even back when I was still in the States, pastoring, and then we would have these conversations, so my dad would tell me things. Yeah, so she was on medication for decades for bipolar, just to prevent the extremes that she was experiencing, right? So that's a chaotic brain, right? That's a chaotic brain, a chaotic nervous system. So we want stable and flexible brain. I mean, we see this a lot. Like most people in the morning will drink coffee to wake up, because without that, they can't wake up. And at night, they will drink alcohol to calm down, right? See, that's a very clear sign of us not having that flexibility. So we need something to kind of bring us here, and then we need something to bring us down. Even though we know alcohol actually does not help with sleep at all. It's the brain under alcoholic influence is not sleeping. It's more sedation. It's a different kind of brainwave. Yeah. So just to give you another illustration why our body really likes to be in that homeostatic state. And this, in fact, is not just an energy system for the rest of our body. It also includes our brain. So this is somebody with blood sugar issues, like diabetic. So you see their blood sugar levels can go from pretty low, maybe in their 60s, 70s, all the way up to 300s and past 300, right? So it can have all these swings or stay up there for a long time and not come down for hours, right? See, like it's 2 p.m. and it's 6 p.m. is still up, and it's just slowly coming back down to normal range at 12 p.m., right? So you can see this is a very chaotic pattern of somebody's energy system is not working right. And that will definitely impact your brain, because your brain, even though it's only about a few pounds, it's just 2 to 3% of our whole body weight. It consumes at least 20% of our daily energy. So when your metabolism is like this, your brain is not going to be stable. It's not possible. Okay, this is my blood sugar. It's pretty much a flat line, right? It doesn't swing a lot. So my energy level is always stable. It doesn't have that big, huge rise, and doesn't have the big crash. Even when I eat fruit, it's like barely budged, right? because my body is more flexible in keeping things in homeostasis. And that's what we want. In fact, that metabolic stability will improve your cognitive stability as well. So I mean, they all play into each other. Okay. So that's what peak functioning brain looks like, right? So what are some of these things that would impact our brain function? So that's what we're going to explore next. But before that, I'm actually going to give you a few principles to keep in mind as we look at what's impacting our brain and what we can do. Principle number one is thoughts and feelings are things. Thoughts and feelings are things. I know a lot of times we think thoughts and feelings, that's so abstract. How can that be thing? This is not a thing, it's not an object. But they are definitely things. Let me show you just something very concrete. Now, when my kids were going through severe depression and anxiety, and they basically dropped out of school at that moment, one of the things we did was we brought them to Amen Clinic in Southern California and have them do a brain scan. And so this is the type of brain scan that they do. They look at the functionings, the workings of the parts of your brain inside as well as the surface. Now, somebody with a healthy brain, when they are just in a relaxed, focused state, actually the brain is pretty quiet. It's not a focused state, but it's just a relaxed state. The brain is pretty quiet. It's just your basic functionings that regulate your body temperature, digestion, hormones, heartbeat, body temperature, and things like that. That part is working, but the rest of the brain is pretty quiet because you're not doing anything. You're just sitting there in a dark room, right? So as you see in a healthy brain in that context is pretty relaxed. Just the back, the white part, the lighter color means there's more activation, there's more activity. Okay, so just kind of the basic, the brainstem, the back of your brain is working, but the rest of it is pretty quiet. Right? Now, this is somebody with PTSD. Their middle part of the brain, you can call it their warning system, the limbic system of their brain is active, even though there's absolutely no danger, no threat, and you should be bored out of your mind, but there's a lot of activity there. And that activity means your neurons are firing, there's chemicals flowing, there's electricity going, right? So what's going on in that person's brain? It's just some vague feelings, right? Maybe some thoughts. But those feelings and thoughts are creating blood flow, and they're creating electrical signals and chemical flow. And they are making the neurological systems even stronger. Because every time there's firing, there's connection, and those channels are established even more. Right? So that's happening. It's a traumatic brain injury, so there's lack of activity, right? And this is kind of a combination of both. Now I want to show you, this is my daughter Yaya's brain scan. So this is when she was extremely depressed and she was not in school anymore. We took her out of school, we went to the States. And you can see this is her brain, that is when it's supposed to be quiet, but you see a lot of activity. They even call it, they even have a name or diagnosis for this diamond pattern here. So we know on the outside she looks extremely depressed. It's absolutely no energy. But inside of her brain, later on, after she recovered, she described it as her, like this mental game that she's playing with herself. There's constant chatter, and she's just trying to suppress or quell. Otherwise, it would just well up and take control of her, right? She's telling herself, I need to do this. And it would just keep replaying, but she could never get herself to actually do it. She just physically could not do it. So there's one time when she already sleep, back then she was sleeping like 14 hours, but she still felt tired. And then she would somehow get up, move from her bed to a sofa, and would just sit there for a couple hours. And that whole time she's telling herself, I need to get up and make myself something to eat. But for 2 hours she can tell herself that, but she cannot do it. It's not because she didn't want to, right? She's exerting tremendous amount of willpower, but she just could not do it. Yeah, so oftentimes we really misunderstand people that are depressed. It's not that they're not working hard or they're not trying hard. They're actually trying harder than, I think most of us, we don't need to try, we just do it, right? But they're actually trying, but they cannot do it. So it's not just oftentimes people tell, why don't you just have more discipline? Why don't you just get yourself to go out and, exercise, see some sunlight, interact with friends. Let go of the thoughts. Well, you can't. It's not because you don't want to, you just can't, right? So this is one of my clients. He also went and got brain scan. And you see it's actually very interesting. There's a whole bunch of holes on the bottom, right? And especially the prefrontal cortex. You can even see a hole on the left front. So this is a lot of individuals with ADHD is like that. And in fact, when the harder they try to focus, the bigger the hole. The harder they try, the less it activates. Yeah, so you tell a little kid with ADHD saying, sit still and focus. Well, that's the very opposite thing that they will be able to do because they can't. They can't have, the harder they try to focus, the less active the brain becomes. And so that's why they just wander around, they're jumping around, looking at all kinds of stuff. But when they're doing that, they're actually listening to you as well. So that's when they actually can work. So when they seem distracted is when they're actually able to work. So they know, that's why they do all these. They're not doing those things just to get you upset, right? So you can see all these thoughts and feelings and emotions, they're actually things happening in your brain. They are physical, they're electrical, it's chemical, it's the neurons connecting. One more, just to illustrate. I feel like most people cannot grasp this. That's why we have so many issues with not understanding people with depression or ADHD, because we don't think there's actually anything happening, but it is physical. These are all things. Now, this is a person with physical pain. That means when you get punched or you get a cut, right? Different parts of your brain light up because it's sensing something. So it's telling you, hey, you're hurt. But look at social pain. Hey, you have a relational friction. Even more areas of your brain light up. But it's also very similar areas. So oftentimes we experience social pain and it feels like physical pain, right, to our brain. And it reinforces those circuits as well. All right, so these are definitely things happening. So that's the first principle, that thoughts and emotions, they are things, and they are creating circuits in our brain. But there's good news, right? The good news is that the brain is shapeable. They call it neuroplasticity. It can change. It can change. Now, it's a double-edged sword in that if we give it bad experiences or bad information or damage, that can also change it for the worse. But if we give it good information, we give it good feedback, we give it good nutrients, good life pattern, good thought patterns, it can change for the better. So it's just very shapeable. It's plastic, right? So it's neuroplasticity. Let me give you a couple of illustrations. This is a person who became blind. So he lost his sight, but he has a visual cortex. So they created this device called, it's called BrainPort. So it uses a camera to capture the image and transcode it, I guess, or change it into a digital format. And that is then translated to tactile sensations on your tongue. So basically, you take an image, you change it to something you can feel with your tongue. So they put that in their mouth, and they use the tongue. Now they use the sensations of the tongue to replace the visual signals that they're getting, because then they lost that. And after some training, the brain actually can interpret that physical sensation on the tongue and tells you what it means visually, right? Okay, so if you go online and just search for BrainPort, you will see some videos of people starting to be able to navigate obstacles and even can pet the dog and even catch a ball and so forth, even though they're blind. Yeah, but that's not just for visual, but auditory, same thing. A person who is deaf can learn to feel and replace auditory information from the ear with sensations on your body. Yeah.
For the deaf.
Let me show you this. Okay.
This is a project I've undertaken with a graduate student in my lab, Scott Novick, who's spearheading this for his thesis. And here's what we wanted to do. We wanted to make it so that sound from the world gets converted in some way so that a deaf person can understand what is being said. And we wanted to do this given the power and ubiquity of portable computing. We wanted to make sure that this would run on cell phones and tablets. And also, we wanted to make this a wearable, something that you could wear under your clothing. So here's the concept. So as I'm speaking, my sound is getting captured by the tablet, and then it's getting mapped onto a vest that's covered in vibratory motors, just like the motors in your cell phone. So as I'm speaking, the sound is getting translated to a pattern of vibration on the vest. Now, this is not just conceptual. This tablet is transmitting Bluetooth, and I'm wearing the vest right now. So as I'm speaking, the sound is getting translated into dynamic patterns of vibration. I'm feeling the sonic world around me. So we've been testing this with deaf people now, and it turns out that after just a little bit of time, people can start feeling, they can start understanding the language of the vest. So this is Jonathan. He's 37 years old. He has a master's degree. He was born profoundly deaf, which means that there's part of his movement that's unavailable to him. So we had Jonathan train with the vest for 4 days, 2 hours a day, and here he is on the 5th day. He feels it on the vest, and he writes it on the board. Where? Jonathan is able to translate this complicated pattern of vibration to understanding himself. Now, he's not doing this.
Yeah, so that's it. So, yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah, actually, for part of our neurofeedback training, David Eagleman, he's a researcher and professor, I think it's at Stanford. So he was there sharing with us as well. It's pretty cool. He has some really good books, accessible books on brain if you are interested in reading up on him. Yeah, but yeah, the point is the brain is retrainable. It's very, very much trainable. In fact, you continue to generate new neurons throughout your life. And so even the concept of, oh, hey, you know, whatever your brain you have right now, it is like when you were 5, you know, that's your brain. So you used to think that, right? After that golden period, that key important period of development in your brain, you don't get any more brain cells. That's not true. So we continue to grow new brain cells. Okay, so brain is trainable. The third principle is that, however, we got to look at a holistic approach. It's not just one thing. It's many, many factors impacting our brain. Just to give you a quick illustration here. You know, right now our society is so focused on seeking pleasure rather than true happiness, right? But these are actually two different things. Yeah, because pleasure is very short term, it's very visceral, meaning we feel it or experience with our body. It's not a bad thing, but oftentimes this is only a very small part of who we are. And it's also generally something that you take for yourself. It's not so much shared with others and you experience it. You experience it, that's mainly it. And usually it's substance-based. It's with something you eat, something you play, or some experience that you have. And it's addictive because it's very much focused on dopamine circuits in our brain. Okay? And I'll talk about why that is later. But happiness, on the other hand, is generally long-term it's something that you give, something you do onto others. You share with others and you do it together. It's not necessarily, most of the time it's not with some substance, right? And it's not addictive. And in terms of neural circuit, we see that it's a much more serotonin-based activity. And it's not that there's anything wrong with dopamine. In fact, we need dopamine. Many individuals struggling with ADHD is because they do not have enough dopamine in their brains, right? So it's a balance of these. Yeah, but our society right now, and this is by Dr. Robert Lustig, it has a really good diagram. I thought it's very, very helpful in understanding this. Is when we become overly activated with dopamine, because dopamine is a excitatory neurotransmitter, meaning this neuron releases dopamine to get the next neuron to do something, to excite it, right? It's an excitatory neurotransmitter. And that is good to a certain extent. When it's too much, the next neuron usually, I mean, the way it works is when it releases the chemical, the neurotransmitter, there's a receptor in the next neuron that takes it in and then activates. But when there's too much, the receptor of the next neuron will start to shut off to protect itself from being overly excited. But what we feel is that you do this thing, whether it's sugar or drugs or whatever activity you do, is no longer exciting. It doesn't feel as exciting as before because the receptor of the next neuron is turning off, shutting down. Right, saying, hey, it's too much. I need to calm down. Otherwise, I'm going to experience damage. But you feel like, hey, this thing is not working anymore. So I'm going to do more so I can feel the same thing, right? So you get the receptor downregulates, so you get more dopamine, so you can feel something, right? So it becomes a negative feedback loop where you build tolerance. And then, because you keep adding more and more, and the receptors keep turning down and down, eventually the neuron actually dies because it's just way too much. And that's when you experience addiction. Right? And this is the pattern, basically, of everything we see, because the businesses know how to activate our dopamine. Yeah. There are even software companies that advertise as, we will come in and help you develop software that is addictive because we know how to activate your dopamine system. And that's what all tech companies do. I mean, even like Google, they would time how fast they refresh an application because they know that if they make you wait a fraction of a second more, your dopamine system will kick in, then you will feel more addicted. And they know exactly how much time they need to make you wait because they've done a lot of A/B testing, right?
So scary.
Yeah, so all these apps, that's why people cannot live without their cell phone now, right? Because they're always like, oh, there's something in the notices, the vibration, and all that these are signals to your body to act a certain way. Now, it's not that dopamine is a bad thing. Remember, we actually need dopamine. That's how we learn. That's how we process memory. It's very important. But if that's all we activate, then it becomes problematic, right? And then oftentimes when our dopamine is elevated, our serotonin becomes off balance. You know, we need both. We need both of them in a good balance. And so when our serotonin becomes downregulated, we fall into a depressive state. And if you know anybody on antidepressants, many of them use what they call SSRI, it's a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Because same thing, the neurons also have receptors for serotonin. And so one neuron will release serotonin, and next one is supposed to receive it. But what the medication attempts to do is, whatever usually the neurotransmitter does not use up, it gets actually recycled. So there's a reuptake valve. So they stop that reuptake process. That's why it's called a reuptake inhibitor. So they leave more of the serotonin around, hoping that the next one will be able to catch it. But that's problematic because the neurotransmitters are not supposed to be floating around these spaces. then it's going to activate glial cells to come and clean that up, because that's actually a waste product. If it's not supposed to be in that space for so long. So anyways, but when it's off balance, we end up with addiction and depression, right? And on top of that, our current society is under chronic stress all the time, right? Because we feel like there's danger, whatever. Right now it's COVID. It could be like political tension, with China or whatever, right? Or maybe jobless rate, or whatever current issue is, or just having a bad relationship at work, or a scary boss, all these things. So our cortisol levels are always high because we are on constant stress, and high cortisol levels, especially when it's long-term, it even impacts our metabolism. Our blood sugar will go up as well. But chronic stress also down-regulates serotonin 1A receptor. So that means your brain cell is not able to catch and receive the serotonin that you're supposed to feel. So stress makes you feel like, hey, I'm sad, I'm depressed, I'm not there's no satisfaction in life, there's no purpose. Because that's what serotonin helps us feel, like we have happiness, we have contentment, we have peace in our hearts. But if your receptor is not working, then you feel like there's no peace, there's no contentment, there's no happiness. And we usually run to addiction because we think that's the same thing. We just do this, maybe I'll be happy, right? But this is not caused by one thing. And I talk about we really need to have a holistic approach to this, because there are a lot of things that can impact this whole process. Sugar addiction, drug addiction, processed food, and I'll talk about how later a little bit. I can't dive too deep into food because that's a whole other series of talks I usually give. But technology, sleep debt, fears and worries, which is so common nowadays, all these things will cause us to feel like, hey, we need to do something just so that we feel up, right? And that contributes to more of this negative cycle. And a lot of these things, especially the top three, will create metabolic syndrome, which is the energy stability problem that we don't have. We cannot metabolize carbohydrates properly, fats properly. Our body is not able to give you stable and constant energy. And when we have metabolic syndrome, our serotonin level goes down as well. So a lot of the depression that we're seeing right now, especially with the lockdown and COVID in the US, is because we're all cooped up at home, eating junk food, and not out there exercising. So, and we also know that metabolic syndrome is one of the factors that made COVID dangerous. Because when we are not, when our insulin sensitivity is low, because insulin is not just a signal that tells us to process sugar, but it's also a signal that tells us how to mount immune functions. Cells' immunity is controlled by insulin as well. So our cells are not sensitive to insulin. We are more prone to disease and sickness and viruses as well. So it's just a very bad negative cycle, right? So it's multifaceted. So you cannot just say, hey, you gotta, willpower your way out of depression, right? You just can't, because there's too many elements. So oftentimes when we think, oh, it's just because this person is lazy, why isn't this person doing something about it? Well, it's a more systematic problem than we realize. And part of it is also just the way the world is built. And we look at how convenient food is in Taiwan, right? You go out everywhere, you can just eat whatever, but usually they're not very good for you. And they will create more of this negative cycle. And so that's definitely what we experience. What we talk about, I talked about my daughter Yaya. So if we look back and ask ourselves what happened, what caused this, we can't pinpoint it on anything in particular. We couldn't. We don't know why. Because I think there are a lot of things added together that that ended up with major depression. It's not one thing, right? But we don't really care what caused it because I don't think we'll ever figure it out. But we know what we need to do to mitigate or to fix it, to recover from it, right? So these are some of the things that we feel helped us. We definitely know that nutrition, we had to, after we are able to take some actions, or more specifically her, after she has a capacity, her brain was restored to a point where she can actually start to do something, we knew that nutrition was huge in helping her recover. In fact, she decided to study nutrition now as for college because she realized how significant that was a factor. We knew that exercise was movement was very important for her as well. Spiritual healing was very, very significant. But what helped her be able to start to engage in these things, including even mental habits, spiritual disciplines, was neurofeedback. That's what, I mean, we knew all these things were important. After we kind of dug into it more, we realized, hey, we got to start doing these things. But she just couldn't. She was in such a bad state that she could do very, very little of what she actually wanted to do, right? So we had to get her mind, get her brain working, at least in a baseline. Then she can start implementing all these things. But we know that all these things needed to come together to heal, but also to maintain, so that she can remain in that peak state. Okay, so factors that will impact our brain health and our emotional health. I mentioned nutrition. Nutrition is a huge one. We need foods that build us up, build up our brain rather than destroy our brain. Okay, I'm just going to talk about two things that's really bad for our brain really quick because there are too many things to talk about, but these are the top two ones. And that is seed oil and sugar, bad oil and sugar. And I categorize all seed oil as bad oil, basically like corn oil, safflower oil, soybean oil, all the vegetable oils. But I don't want to use the term vegetable oil because there are olive oil that is actually helpful. There's coconut oil, those are plant as well. But that's not from the seed, that's from the fruit. Like avocado oil, that's actually from the fruit. But the seed-based oils are very, very damaging. I'm not going to get into all the science on how and why that is, but I can show you some graphs of its impact. So this is a graph tracking how much the seed oils are consumed in the US. So before 1900, there's barely any. I mean, people just do not, that's not even a thing. Right? So throughout 99% of human history, seed oil is not a thing. Nobody used it. And then it started to come up when because it was first discovered as an industrial production byproduct. It's like, oh, these cottonseed oil, what do we do with it? It smells bad. Hey, what if, make it into something edible? So that's basically what happened. And you see the consumption start to go up, especially in the 60s, it went way up. And what we see is that when we eat these oil, they become part of our body. So this is a measurement of this kind of seed oil, they call it linoleic acid in body fat in human beings. So in 1950, that's already a pretty high point, right? So it was 9.1%. And that's considered low compared to 2008's 21%. Right now, it's probably even higher, right? Because they only have data to up to 2008. But 9.1% is way too high already. In most indigenous populations, like people that are still living in a very traditional way, it's only about 3%, 2%. Because naturally, you don't have access to these you eat some nuts, you get a little bit. You eat some animal fats has a little bit, but it's very, very small. Our body should not be composed of these kind of fats because they become our cell structure. Our cell structure doesn't operate very well with this kind of fat, but now it's very, very high. And you see then that line that you see basically follows almost exactly as the obesity prevalence in the US, right? Because this will mess up our metabolism, and including our brain metabolism. Yeah, that's what's really scary. So, and this is even worse than sugar and carbs, because look, up to a point, carbohydrate consumption actually start to drop because people realize, hey, maybe there's something wrong with eating too much carbs, right? Even sugar. People start to cut down on sugar, but it still went up. So it's not just the carbs and the sugar. Sometimes we over-demonize carbs and sugar. Good carbohydrates are actually okay, and it's even good for you. But that oil is definitely not. But it's so hard to escape that kind of oil now, because everywhere you go, any restaurant, any fast food, any processed food that's made ready to eat, I'm sure they use that oil because that's cheap. And it's everywhere, right? So they're not going to use olive oil to cook for you or use butter because that's much more expensive. That's why when we do this place, I told them we'll never use any of that oil. We only use butter or olive oil. That's it. You know, we're not going to add anything else because that destroys you. All right, so this is another graph. This is by Dr. Kay Shanahan. None of these graphs are, I did not create any of these, by the way, so I gotta give credit for these researchers and doctors that create these. But Kay Shanahan, see, this is the seed oil usage, right? It's barely anything, and it just shot up. And this is obesity diabetes and pre-diabetes. Same thing, it just went up. It almost matches exactly, right? Yeah. So, but we also know that the body can repair. I know that you probably heard me talking about why I go on ketogenic diet, and even for a period of time I was doing carnivore, because we know that ketone, that particular molecule that is produced by your liver when it metabolizes fat, is very anti-inflammatory, and especially in the brain, because that particle is small enough that it can get to your brain, and your brain can use it as energy as well as molecules to deal with the oxidations that's happening in your brain, because it also acts as an antioxidant. So if your body is very good at producing ketones and utilizing ketones, it can calm the inflammations in your brain. And they have discovered that a lot of the mental issues that people are experiencing is because your brain is inflamed. So if you can calm the brain, we know that individuals with ADHD, with autism, depression, they all have some sort of inflammation. Alzheimer's, right now, people are very scared of dementia. There's always some sort of inflammation in your brain. So if you can have something naturally to reduce the inflammation, a lot of that will recover. Right? Also know that ketogenic diet, when you are able to use a diet, it doesn't always need to be ketogenic, so such a strict diet either. It's just if we can teach your body to rely less on carbohydrates so it doesn't continue to create the inflammation and is able to create ketones and utilize ketones, a lot of that repair can happen. We also know that like the ketogenic diet was used to treat epilepsy before medications were invented, because epilepsy is a kind of a firing of your brain that is out of sync or out of whack. That's too strong. So one of the things that they discovered is the GABA glutamine balance. GABA is glutamine is another excitatory neurotransmitter. But GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. In fact, serotonin is also an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So it tells the next cells to chill out, to relax, right? So when you have the excitatory neurotransmitter and the inhibitory neurotransmitter out of balance, that's one of the causes for seizures and epilepsy. So they discovered that if your brain runs on ketone, these two neurotransmitters can be naturally in much better balance. So that eventually will address the seizure issue. So we know what we eat and how our metabolism works impacts our emotions and our brain. Right? So that's the first one, nutrition. Movement is another one that is also very big. Sedentary lifestyle, we know that will damage our metabolism. So that's a kind of an indirect way, because our body is really designed to move, right? And we don't move enough. Our muscle is the largest organ in our body. So you got to look at it as a system. So if our muscle is not being activated, it's not being engaged, where it's wasting, it's going to impact the rest of our body as well. So metabolic dysfunction, right? I mentioned earlier with that graph, metabolic dysfunction. Muscle is a huge organ that impacts our metabolism. Right? But also when we engage in movement, our brain will have more of this thing called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. People call this the miracle grow for your brain cells. So this is a brain hormone that allows your brain to generate more brain cells. So if you don't have enough of that, your brain cells will not be able to be replenished, right? And you want to continue to build brain cells for the rest of your life. So movement is very crucial in that. And also we know that when we're out there exercising, we also have a lot more of these happy neurotransmitters going on in our brain, right? It just literally feels good, feels better. And those are upregulated. So movement can help. In fact, according to research, they said that if you are somehow able to get yourself to be out there exercising, exercise is at least as effective as antidepressants, sometimes even more so. So we know that it's at least as good and oftentimes more effective than medication without the side effects. But of course, I also know that when you're feeling bad, you're just feeling bad. You can't get out. You just can't get yourself to get out there, right? Yeah, that's why a lot of relational support or people's encouragement maybe can be helpful. But we know movement is very powerful in maintaining, at least. The other one is recovery. And the biggest factor in recovery is sleep, right? Our body always needs to recover. Our brain needs to recover. And sleep is the most important thing that we can do for our recovery. Lack of sleep, if you just sleep, let's say 4 hours the previous night, today your brain function is like a person who was drunk. Basically, yeah. It really deteriorates. But we don't think it's so serious, but it is. Sleep, because sleep is important for brain detox. When you are sleeping during that deep sleep, there are fluids that gets flushed into your brain to flush out the toxins, because our brain doesn't have the same lymphatic system that the rest of our body has. Our lymphatic system is like a detoxification system. So it parallels our bloodstreams. But our brain doesn't, because it's too packed in there. So what it does is when you sleep, your brain's blood vessels will shrink and it will create space for they call it lymphatic fluids to flow through that shrunken blood vessel, that is space that's created with the shrunken blood vessel. So, but it only happens when you are in that sleep state. So if you don't have enough of that, you don't get to detox as much as your brain actually needs. We also know that sleep is crucial for your memory formation. If you don't sleep, all the things you learn and experience that day does not get stored into long-term storage, and it doesn't get processed, and so you don't make enough that connection. Even if it gets transferred to long-term storage, but you don't have the REM sleep cycle, then the relationship between these pieces of information actually does not get solidified. So you might memorize certain facts, but you have no idea what they mean. You cannot apply them. And that's true for experiences as well. That's why when you have negative experience or even traumatic experience, sleep is crucial, because during sleep you also process that experience and hopefully digest it and get rid of the harmful parts and only keep the lessons you learned or the growth that you can have come out of it. So sleep is very crucial, but then we also see a lot of people undergoing trauma, not able to sleep. And so that's like a double damage to the brain. So recovery, the other one is we got to detox. Our body has natural capacity to get rid of toxins, but if we don't have enough detoxification happening, it also damages our brain. Or if we have too much toxins going into our body, it damages our brain. This is food coloring, red dye number 40, which is very common in a lot of foods nowadays, unfortunately. But this is brain. You see the similar brain scan, right, from Dr. Amen. This is brain before eating something with red dye number 40, and this is after eating it. So you see a lot more activation just because they ate something. So these food additives are pretty toxic to our brain. So like you look at M&Ms, a lot of colors, Skittles with a lot of colors. Of course, most of the time, hopefully, we have good detoxification system. Our liver function is good, our kidney function is good, we're eating enough nutrients. But if we're eating junk food all the time, we're getting too much of it, and our detoxification system is not working very well. Okay. Another factor is spiritual, emotional health. We may experience trauma, traumatic experiences, whether it may be something relational or maybe going through physical danger. But these things oftentimes get stuck in our nervous system. So the traumatic experience is not just something whether you quote unquote remember or not in terms of, oh, I can articulate what happened, I can describe what happened. A lot of times we experience something and we don't even know exactly verbally or explicitly how to describe it. But our body feels it because our body's nervous system reaction to it, as well as our brain's storage of that experience, is very deeply ingrained. Now, there's good reason for it to do that because our brain is always trying to capture information so that it can detect danger in the future, right? So it incorporates that information because it wants to protect you. But if it's not processed properly, it can get you stuck in a, I guess, overreactive state, right? So we become oversensitive to these things. So that's why things like this prolonged fear cycle of like the COVID news in the US, for example. A lot more people are suicidal, a lot of people are depressed. I also read about many more cases of child abandonment because the parents feel like they just cannot handle it, so they just abandon their kids. And so the child protective services, the social services are also overwhelmed with cases like that nowadays. Right? So, and because to them, they are experiencing prolonged trauma and this constant fear. Right? And so it's literally reshaping how our mind think of experiences or inputs. Okay. And that can even include spiritual trauma, because sometimes the church can be a place that puts so much guilt and shame onto you. In fact, you become traumatized, or there's so much rejection you feel or judgment you feel that can, in fact, be very hurtful as well. Okay. Something else related to the spiritual, relational, emotional part, it's relationships, right? We know that relationship is very powerful in reshaping and healing our brain. Like if you hug somebody every day, it'll reduce your chance of getting the flu by 69%, according to research. I wrote it down. Yeah, because when we have that physical contact with somebody who you care about, who you love, your body's oxytocin level will go up, which is an important neurochemical as well as a chemical hormone that our body uses to make connection. Oxytocin even makes your blood vessels relax. Your heart can function better with oxytocin. When you give somebody a hug, when you have good relationship, when you have very satisfying conversation, your serotonin gets boosted, right? This is something that's very, very healing. So when you take that away, it can create some issues, but when you have enough of it, it can repair your brain. Yeah.
Does that work for the pets? Like,
Pets?
petting your pets,
I think so.
I don't know. I haven't run any research. But yeah.
Therapy, so
Yeah, probably because animal therapy.
There's a website called Animal Doctor. Do you know that?
Yeah.
So cool.
Yeah, that's why we also did hippotherapy when I was at the center. Yeah. So we did hippotherapy, horses, and Akua was my dog, my black lab was there. He was actually interacting with the kids, so that one of the therapists actually brought him to interact with the kids. Yeah, so yeah, we definitely know. My lab is a 狗医师, right? Yeah, so relationship, spiritual practices, we know that it's very, very important, very helpful. We talked about we sometimes can experience spiritual trauma or religious trauma, but we also know that real, authentic connection with brothers and sisters, with God, is very, okay, I'm not even talking about on a spiritual level. We definitely know that there's significant spiritual impact. But even on the physical level, these spiritual practices will calm our default mode network, which is the part of our brain that is always trying to predict the future and then fall into worry, or looking at the past with all the regrets and fall into depression, right? So it even calms that part of our brain. And when you engage in spiritual practices like prayer, contemplation, meditation, it strengthens our prefrontal cortex, which is the part that, if you saw the picture from before, that oftentimes shuts down and when you're trying to focus, right? It releases this neurochemical called anandamide, which is, people talk about smoking weed, right? Marijuana. But one of the chemicals in marijuana is THC. And anandamide is a chemical that our brain naturally releases that has a very, very similar structure to THC. So this is our body. Our body actually has all these natural chemicals that's supposed to make us feel good or give us positive emotions, instead of these other external chemicals that we'll put in. Our brain has receptors for morphine-like compounds. In fact, when you go exercise, you get endorphin because that's a very similar chemical as morphine. So anandamide is something that's very similar to THC. So we engage in these spiritual practices, our brain will produce more this THC-like substance. And it boosts both of our dopamine as well as serotonin. So there's just a lot of, besides the spiritual benefits, there's a lot of neurological benefits in spiritual practices. But this is not about guilting us into doing it, because we know that when we actually try, it's actually quite difficult. It's very hard, because I think just the way the whole society is built, and what people value as important, as well as all the processed food, the easy, cheap, but very harmful foods that we have, kind of creates this habit and lifestyle that's actually quite difficult to break. Okay, so what can we do to improve our brain function? Number one is really to optimize metabolic health. We talked about this many times now. Our lack of exercise can impact it. Our eating bad seed oils, and in some ways, too much carbohydrate, especially refined carbohydrate, can damage our metabolic health, right? So we got to optimize our metabolic health, basically eliminate the harmful seed oils, and reduce, it definitely eliminate added sugar, but reduce carbohydrate consumption for a while until our metabolism back to normal, then I think a carbohydrate in itself is not a bad thing. Okay, so it's not just about adding this and adding that, and that's usually the typical approach. You think, oh, you're not feeling well, take this, or add this. You need to eat more of this. Well, it's not going to do anything for you until you stop the damage. We have to first stop the continual damage. Then all these other things can be helpful. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing, maximize sleep quality. We have to prioritize sleep. I think in the US, there's a lot more research that came out in the past 5 years or so that really look into sleep and how sleep impacts our performance. So there's even studies where they move the start time of high schools an hour later, and just from that, the average SAT score for the senior class went up 200 points. Yeah, just from 1 extra hours of sleep. 200 out of 1,600, that's a huge chunk, just with more sleep. Yeah. Because we know sleep is when all the learning actually take place and solidify. So, and they also discover when they do that, accident rates drop significantly. Car accidents. So sleep is very important, and in terms of what can help you sleep better, avoid harmful lights at night. Too much screen, blue lights is very bad. We're not getting enough red light in the morning, or we don't see sun, so our circadian rhythm is off. These things impact us. Eating too late also impact our sleep quality. So it's really about, are we in a good routine that is natural? Just like, are we eating natural foods, real foods? So, because our body is, designed to function a certain way. And our modern society, with all the advancements, try to make us more efficient. It's true. Of course, there's a lot of things. I use computer all the time. But I think we need to understand what are some of the possible negative implications of these kind of technology and how do we mitigate it. We're not saying don't use it. Of course I use it. But I wear these funny colored looking glasses when I use it at night, even during the day, because there's too much blue light emission even during the day. So maximize sleep, and then gotta have soul nourishing relationships, because when we talk about the serotonin and dopamine relationships, boosting impacts from relationships. There's a very interesting research that I saw. It says if your neighbor, if you're happy, if you're a happy person, your neighbor is 34% more likely to be happy as well. And that person's neighbor is 15% more likely to be happy. So there is that positive impact. But if you're grumpy, I think it's also, right, it's a double-edged sword. Yeah, so, I've been having this spiritual discipline small group upstairs once a week. And these people didn't really know each other, but they kind of form a pretty good bond, because I try to create a very safe place, and they can really pour out what's going on, and we can process it together through spiritual practices. And that group experience has a tremendous positive impact, because they feel like, wow, I didn't know I can talk about something so freely and so openly, and there are people that accept me. Right? That in itself is very transformative. And oftentimes even a church small group, sometimes we feel like, I don't know if I can say this, because what if I say this and it's not the PC thing, it's not the right thing, and I get judged, or people start to look at me weird, right? Or they think I'm a bad person. So there's a lot of judgment that can happen that can totally shut this down. But this is the very thing we need. We need that place where we can have authenticity. So finding individuals or contexts like this is very, very healing. And so that kind of moves us into this spiritual practices. And this is, I'm not talking about a lot of things that we've been hearing in the typical church, modern day church, because oftentimes we think of spiritual practices, you think of like, oh, I'm just reading my Bible in the morning, or I am praying, but most of my praying is really asking for things, right? I'm trying to say things, and that's the extent of my spiritual practices. But I'm more talking about the classic traditions, the contemplation, the solitudes, the fastings, the silence, and these kind of things. Those are more deep state practices that really allows our physical body to feel our emotional state, and it becomes aligned with our mental state, right? So it's things that's much deeper. It's not just in a cognitive, intellectual level, because our brain's capacity, there's only 5% of our brain's capacity is on this cognitive, explicit level. This 95% that's not. And so the spiritual practices, I think the power is really aligning those 95% so that it's working with the 5% that you are aware of. So it doesn't feel like you're double-minded, like what the Bible says, James talk about. So engage in these spiritual practices. The individuals I came to talk about how I'm able to sleep better, or my relationship with my husband and kids improve, and just because now they are in a much more aligned state, their body, mind, and the spirits are more aligned, but even more importantly, they're aligned with the Spirit of God. They're aligned with God's presence in them. Yeah. Okay, and these are so far our strategies that you can just practice starting now. I mean, anybody can do this. Right. What are some other things? There are tons of ways we can learn about these things, right? I have a whole bunch of books here on how to improve your diet, how to improve your brain function, and things like that. So there are lots of books, seminars, trainings, even online trainings. A lot of things I learn. Of course, I have formal training, but also a lot of it is I continue to learn from books. I'm constantly reading or listening to some book in these areas. Every day, there's always some time set aside to do this. Or you go on official, maybe even online trainings. A lot of things are available. Go on these retreats. You learn about these things. So I think we have to take our own mental, brain, and physical and emotional health in our own hands, because I think a lot of what's available out there, of course, the hospital systems, doctors have good intentions, but they only have so much time, or they only have their expertise in one area, and usually it's not one area that is creating what we're experiencing. It's multiple facets. Even therapists, it's very important. It's good to be able to talk to somebody and process a lot of that. But then maybe there are other things that this person is not aware of, maybe with diet or exercise, for example. Right? But oftentimes it's a combination of all these things coming together. So you almost have to be your own advocate. And that's what we discovered. I continue to work with Yaya. That's one of the driving forces of my learning. As well as whenever I see a new client and there's something new that I'm not aware of, I don't know how to help, I just go out and try to find solutions. So we got to continue. We have to continue in our learning. Of course, there are things like spiritual practices, coaching, and this is actually one of the things I wish that our church can do more of. Maybe in the future we'll be able to develop something like this, where you can coach somebody through these spiritual practices, where you can build a safe place, but also not just like some woo-woo thing. Sometimes people feel like, what are you talking about? I don't know. So I think there's a lot of good science, and then we should be able to incorporate that But I don't think these are mutually exclusive. You can have solid science and solid spirituality and theology, and I think it's important to be able to integrate these things as well as put into practice the things, the modalities and methods that it's been even researched. We know that it works. Or it's very old traditions that we kind of have forgotten about because we think we are also scientific. We're so smart. We neglect the wisdoms of people in the past. There are actually a lot of good contemplative traditions from the time Jesus came all the way till now. We've got 2,000 plus years of a lot of rich traditions that we kind of sometimes have rejected and we need to bring back. And as some of you know, personally, I do health coaching as well. And sometimes, for some people, that's what they need. Because it's not that these information or methods are not available, but it is a lot of work to try to curate and read all this stuff and try to figure out, is this true? Is this not true? Because there's also a lot of conflicting information out there. I think that's one part. The other part that I'm finding is that some people, they know this is what they want to do, but having accountability in a small group is much more effective. And that's why health coaching, as well as spiritual coaching or small group, is effective because of that accountability element. And it's consistent. Every week you have to come. You know, we want you to share openly, and once you share, people can step in and help. Health coaching, part of it is also troubleshooting, because we all definitely run into, like, when I say ketogenic diet, you know, maybe not everybody should be on ketogenic diet, or there are different approaches depending on where you are. It's not one size fit all. So sometimes we read a book and it seems like, wow, it's so great, I just got to do this. And you try it and you hit a wall, you know, because they can't, I'm sure they know a lot more than what they write in the book. Because the book is, you know, it's not going to be like this big, right? They can't put everything they know, so they have to put in what is mostly, like I remember meeting this lady, the author of this book, Pleroma Coaching. She's also a neurofeedback practitioner, and she's a nutritionist, and she has excellent stuff. And then she will tell you, she developed a whole other online course out of this book because of the things that she cannot put in there. Right? The publishers won't publish it because it's too big, right? And so you read that to get you started, but then you have all this added information that you can learn. So that's where sometimes health coaching can help, because this person can help you navigate. Last thing I'll talk about really quick is neurofeedback. And this is the training modality that really helped our kids turn over and got off medication and all that and start to function normally. It's a form of biofeedback, but it's focused on the brain. So we call it a training because we're not making it do something. We're not adding any information to your brain. We are only detecting what is happening with your brain in terms of brainwave and processing that information and show it back to you visually, auditorily, and tactilely. So you can see something, hear something, feel something that is a representation of your brain state. So I'm not changing the brainwave, I'm not adding information to the brainwave. It's only reading it and then showing it back to you in the way that your brain can understand. It's not even your explicit awareness that can understand. It's your implicit awareness or your pre-conscious or your automatic functions of your brain. Just like when we are young, when we hear a sound, we don't assign meaning to that sound. It's just gibberish. But over time, your brain figures out, hey, this pattern, it seems to be associated with this, and it starts to form connections, and form networks, and it becomes meaning. So our brain is always detecting inputs from the outside, whether it's sound, light, touch, through our senses, and trying to make sense of that information. So this technology takes advantage of that capacity of our brain to recognize patterns by giving itself its own pattern. Yeah, that's why it's called a feedback. Yeah, so it's a form of brain training, and when you give it enough times and it's trying to figure out long enough, it starts to make sense of it, and when it makes sense of it, it will start to adjust itself. The brain wants, because remember I talked about homeostasis, right? Because our body always wants to be in that optimal state. So when you give your brain enough information, the brain wants to find an optimal state for itself as well. So we are not trying to get the brain to do what it doesn't want to do. We're saying, well, I'm going to give you information on this part of your operation, because our different cortex have different functions. So I say, I'm going to give you information on this part or this part or this part, and then you figure out what is optimal for you. Okay. And so what it looks like is this. So I have electrodes connected to somebody's various cortex areas. And then so it reads the signal in, and I have an amplifier that, because our brain signal is actually quite weak, especially it has to pass through the skull and a lot of protective layers, but it detects it, and then this amplifier will amplify the signal and send it to a computer. And the computer will change it into something that represents it and give it back to you. So the person is usually watching something or had headphones on listening to something and holds a bear that vibrates and changes its vibration according to your brainwave. And me as a trainer, I can see what's happening with that person's brainwave at different frequencies. So it's just a feedback loop, but we trust that the brain is designed so well that it's, we talk about AI, right? AI is basically feeding lots of information and it will figure something out. Well, our brain's been doing that for tens of thousands of years and much better. So it's a form of exercise your brain, because we talked about earlier that if you give your brain information, it'll do something about it. And if you let it fire and release chemicals, release electricity over and over again, then it starts to get stronger. The neural networks get stronger and solidifies, and it forms those circuits. And what we like to see is the circuits that is destructive to you because of disuse can weaken. And you build new circuits and strengthen them so that they become your dominant circuit. It becomes your automatic. Right? So we will train for things like mental performance, like focus, clarity, attention, reasoning. Behavior and action is more like, and a lot of that is inhibitory. Like when you know you shouldn't do something, you don't want to do something, but you couldn't stop yourself. You see a lot of kids with attention issues like that, right? They know it's irritating to their sibling, but they're just going to jump in and do it anyways, right? It's an inhibitory issue. Right, so a lot of that is strengthening your inhibitory circuits. And so it can be, there are even executives who would do something like that so that they can keep their thinking clear. They're not pulled by all because they have an information overload all the time, especially maybe higher level executives. They have to decide what is important, what is not, right? Or kids, like I mentioned, kids with ADHD, everything is fun, everything is important, everything is stimulating. So they're just like, right? But you have to be able to filter out. So mental performance, emotional resilience, especially nowadays with fear, anxiety, depression. And part of that, like I said, it's normal because our brain is trying to find danger before it happens. So it's detecting, but when it's oversensitive, it's overactive. So, and that the subconscious part of your brain detects something, even though it's not that dangerous, but it feels very dangerous to that part of your brain, so it throws up to your executive function and overwhelms you, right? Or the mid part of the brain takes so much energy away, you have no capacity here in your prefrontal cortex, your executive function. So if we can calm that part of the brain so it's not overly excited, then your executive function can come back online. There's also physiological stability. Remember that graph from the very, very beginning. Our nervous system should be in that stable and flexible state as well. And so oftentimes before I even train these executive functions or logic or creativity, I'm just trying to stable that person's nervous system so that they can begin to sleep. so that their firing is not erratic, so that they can calm down, go into more recovery state, or a sedentary state, or a resting state when it needs to. Because most people nowadays, we have high cortisol, we are stuck in gas pedal mode, our sympathetic nervous system is on full throttle, and we just can't come back. We can't even come back to the middle. And then definitely cannot sleep, right? That's why people take sleeping pills and use alcohol and so forth. Yeah, so these are some of the things that we train for. And usually it's about a 3-month process. It depends. Some people need more. It just depends on how responsive the brain is, and I have no say in that. I do my best to give it as clean as information as possible, and also training sites as well as frequencies that is appropriate for that person. But generally, after assessment, it's 20 sessions of training, twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week if people want to pack it in a little bit more. So that's the general process, and it's about, if it's twice a week, it's about 3 months. Yeah. Who would use something like this? Generally 2 extremes. You have individuals that just kind of run out of options. Like I try everything, it doesn't work. So I get a lot of that. They literally try everything, and this is kind of the last resort. It's like, it doesn't work, I'm without hope, which is kind of scary. Like, that person's entire hope is on you. And, you know, so I know God heals, because definitely I think what I can do is very, very limited. But unfortunately, that's a great majority of people that I encounter, which I think is very unfortunate, because I think if you start much earlier before it gets so bad, it'll be much less suffering. But usually I get it as a last resort because people don't understand what this is. And also cost is very high because it's not standard medicine you can just go into a hospital and get. Even in the US, it's really not covered by insurance or anything like that. It's just,
What does it do?
Some people, this gets them to a certain place, but then they feel like there's more that they can get out of it. Like, I know for my kids, the reason why I got into it is because after Yaya went through this 20 sessions, she was good enough to get back to school, but we know it's far from optimal. We know that that's not the way she was. Yeah, so that's why we end up, the therapists encourage us to learn it, because I was also at that time working with adults with intellectual disabilities, and like 70% of them are on some kind of psychiatric medication. Very high, very much more pervasive than general population. Yeah, so I was using it for a lot of our clients at our center as well.
Would this be applicable?
Yeah, every case is different. I have people that after 20 sessions, I do another assessment. We see enough improvement. We know that it's working, but we also know that there's room. So maybe they'll do 10 more or another 20 sessions. There are also people that after 20, they feel like, hey, maybe this is good enough, or it's just too expensive, they can't afford it, but then come back like 6 months later. So I have somebody that did this and is helped with her depression, as well as this syndrome called Erland's, which is a visual decoding issue. She didn't even know she had this thing, because she just thought all my life I cannot read properly. And so when I was growing up in elementary school and middle school, people think I'm stupid, right? I'm like in the special class. But she knows that she's not. She can understand everything. She has, logical understanding. She just cannot read. It's just every time she reads, she doesn't feel like she wants to. She cannot never understand what she reads. And so, and she's in her 20s already. And so when she came in and she starts to describe, and now I was already halfway through my sessions, like 10 sessions in, and she was describing, and I started to ask her, I just became very curious. And I suspected that it could be Erland, so I have these color sheets. Basically, it filters out what you see, filter certain colors out with what you see. And particular color, when it's filtered out, all of a sudden she can see straight. Yeah, so this is a brain decoding issue. And in Taiwan, there's almost no awareness of this issue. It's not dyslexia. It's different from dyslexia. Yeah, so I discovered that she had that. So I let her borrow my color sheets, so she started just putting on everything she reads, and then she can actually finally start to read. Yeah, but then after some training, she discovered, hey, I don't even need this because my brain got fixed. I can just read normally.
Those cases affect even reading Mandarin.
Reading Mandarin? Yeah, sure. She's reading Chinese. She's local Taiwanese. Yeah. That worked pretty well. And then just this case I just mentioned about Erland. I have trained 2 individuals with Erlands now. One is a kid. She came when she was maybe, I think, 3rd or 4th grade. Yeah, same thing. After training, she was wearing funny colored glasses, and she didn't want to wear it because she would make her look funny in school, right? Yeah, so I mean it's very sad, right? Because kids tease you, and then so she wouldn't wear it, and it's creating a lot of problem. But now she doesn't need to wear it. Yeah, and for this young adult, it also worked pretty well. Actually, no. There's a 3rd kid also with Erlands. Yeah, they also was able to get out those glasses. I mean, the glasses are helpful. I mean, if you have no options, that will allow you to read. So yeah, it seems to work. Adults, I think the complexity with adults is that sometimes there's more traumatic baggage. So like this is not gonna like take away your memory because this doesn't alter your brain. So if you have trauma, it can help your brain calm down enough so you can actually process it, right? But it's not gonna teach you how to think. So this is where I think therapists is important to work through the trauma. But I think the unfortunate thing is that sometimes these individuals have gone through a lot of therapy, but sometimes they feel like, oh, this is not helpful. Well, it's not that it's not helpful, but their brain is not in a place where it's receptive, I think. So if you can do these 2 things together, it can be much more helpful. So I think adults, generally, you have more of these kind of layers. You have to peel away. That is more challenging. Or individuals, sometimes they do this, they feel like, well, I'm feeling better already, so I think I'm okay. But they do not spend the time to work through the trauma. And so you can come back. This is where I also feel like, sometimes I try to do as much as I can, even in session, to work through these traumas, if they're willing. Because I think these need to work together. Okay, so that's